Kia ora koutou. I just want to clarify a few things about interviewing this week. Specifically, I want to talk about the hunter and farmer methods and the interrogation versus conversation that Studs Terkel talks about. And then I want to connect those a little bit to the A1 analytical essay, okay? If you listen carefully to the hunter and farmer methods talked about in the How Sound, and not just assume what hunter and farmer means, but actually listen very carefully, there's a key difference between asking direct and indirect questions and doing hunter and farmer method, okay? Yes, the farmer method is a kind of open-ended conversational style where the interviewee plants some metaphorical seeds and then sees where the conversation grows and evolves based on where the interviewee takes the discussion and the kinds of things that they say. So it's very open-ended that way. That is the farmer method. The hunter method is not a direct line of questioning, okay? A direct line of questioning is, what's your thought about the current prime minister? Do you agree with such and so legislation? It's very specific and detailed and direct questions. That's direct questioning. That is not the hunter method, okay? The hunter method, if you listen close to the How Sound podcast, is knowing in advance the exact kind of response you think your interviewee is likely to say, and then trying to get them, or the response you want your interviewee to say, and then asking questions in a particular way to get that exact response. It is almost manipulative. Okay. And they talk about the ethics of this. Rob Rosenthal does in the How Sound podcast. So go back and listen. And you might say, why would anyone ever want to control an interviewee? Well, keep in mind that what you're doing here is different than traditional journalism, as we set up in the beginning of the course. This is not the same as objective journalism, where you're trying to keep your distance from the topic and pretend you're not a part of the story. Here, you're creating a very specific story. You're acknowledging that you're subjectively telling this story in a particular way, and you want to gather certain quotes that help create this certain image or this certain scene or this certain idea that you're trying to get across in your narrative nonfiction podcast story. Okay, so for example, if you're telling a story about, let's say, basketball, for example, I like basketball, and you want to talk about my favorite team is the San Antonio Spurs, and we don't like the Los Angeles Lakers, right? If I go to a basketball game and fans are coming in, I know someone wearing a Spurs jersey is likely to not like the Los Angeles Lakers, so I might deliberately go up to them because I want some audio that really gives the listener a sense of how deep this rivalry between these two fan clubs and these two basketball teams is. And so I want some audio that has Spurs fans really against the Lakers, and really super supporting their team. And I want Lakers fans who really love their team and despise my favorite team. And so I want to get very, not just words, answers to a question, but emotional content as well. Okay? That's when you might use the hunter method. Go up to a Spurs fan and say, I hear you're a big fan of the Los Angeles Lakers, aren't you? And they'll go, no way. They'll really, you set up deliberately, you word the question in a way to get that kind of response. You could also do it with political stuff, for example, right? Someone who... you could do it with politics because people tend to be just as polarized about politics as well. I don't need to give any examples. You can imagine going up to a political conservative or a political liberal and asking them about the opposing party and what they think about it, and how you might try to get certain specific reactions that help tell your story of a politically divided country, for example. Okay, so that's an example of the hunter method. It does border on manipulation, and there are ethical questions to be raised there. And I encourage you to go back and listen to How Sound and think about the ethics of hunter method versus farmer method in the rhetorical situation of the story that you're telling. Each story will be different. The ethical consequences, it's not 100% right or wrong to use the hunter method. It depends on the rhetorical situation, like everything in this course. What is your topic? Who is your interviewee? What's the larger cultural context? What's your approach to the topic? Who are you as a person asking these kinds of leading questions in the Hunter method? All of those things help you determine whether you are being ethical or unethical in the way that you approach a Hunter style questioning in an interview. Okay? Hunter and farmer method. That's that. I want to now say, let's talk about interrogation versus conversation. Okay. It is not the same to say that Hunter method is interrogation and the farmer method is a conversation. Okay. Then they're nuanced and a little more different than that. Okay. That's an oversimplification to say that they line up just perfectly. They have overlaps, certainly, but they're not perfect matches. Okay. So, Studs Terkel and Tony Parker are two of the most famous oral historians in the United States and in New Zealand, or United States and in England. And there are other great oral historians here in New Zealand. I recommend, for example, the work of Hare Williams, who's a terrific oral historian, Maori oral historian here. But when you're doing oral history, like when you're doing narrative nonfiction podcasting, you typically want to engage in a more conversational style rather than an interrogation. If you're doing journalism, where you're speaking to people in power, politicians, CEOs, and you're trying to hold them accountable for the decisions that you're making, this is what journalists do, right? In a free press and a democracy holds people in power accountable. You do want to ask more interrogative questions that are direct and trying to interrogate them to say, are you making the right decisions for the people in this country? Yeah, that's appropriate in journalism. Not so much in narrative nonfiction, okay? In narrative nonfiction, you're often not always working with people in huge positions of power. Sometimes you are, but oftentimes you're working with vulnerable communities or communities who don't often have their voices heard. And so the power dynamic's different. And you really want to treat these people with humanity, not just as sources of information, but also as real, living, breathing human beings who have stories to share. And that involves what Studs Terkel says, listening. Listen, 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 he says, okay? And you have to do that, you have to engage in a conversation. And he offers many really great methods in there for going about that. And I encourage you to think about which of those methods suit your own practice. He never writes down his questions, for example. You may feel more comfortable writing down questions. Oftentimes it's useful to circulate your questions to the interviewees in advance. That puts them at ease to make sure they're not going to get surprised or caught off guard. But maybe you leave space to say, these are some of the questions I might ask, and we'll follow the conversation and see where it goes. So you can let your interviewee know these are the kinds of things we might talk about, but leave space for you to do a little Studs Terkel and take and listen to what they're really saying and take the conversation in another way if that's the direction the interviewee wants to go. Okay? That's conversational rather than interrogation. And what I want to say here is I want to go back to the Jad Abumrad moment in the More Perfect podcast by Radiolab about the Commerce Clause, okay? This is called One Nation Under Money, and it's all about this. It's an incredible podcast about this super detailed, tiny legal jargon, frankly, that's a really boring story to tell, typically, except that Radiolab packages it with their sound design, with their creation of scenes and characters, and makes it a much more interesting story. And the middle narrative is about the owner of a barbecue joint, and Jad Abumrad, in a narrative nonfiction podcast, is interviewing a owner of a barbecue joint who supported segregation, who formerly supported the idea that whites could eat inside his barbecue restaurant, but Black Americans had to eat outside of it. Okay. And Jad has a rather tense conversation with him. And listen very closely to that. Play it back and forth and ask yourself after each question that Jad asks, is that more of a conversational question or is it an interrogation? Nothing in this course is 100% interrogation or conversation, 100% formal narrator, 100% informal narrator. Nothing in narrative nonfiction is 100% anything. It's always in the gray area between the black and white. Okay, so be careful on your essays to say anything is an informal podcast, because it's not just informal. It's mostly informal. It tends to be more informal. Okay, there are always moments where podcasters move along a spectrum of formal to informal, or in this case, hunter method and farmer method, or conversation and interrogation. Okay, and if you listen really closely, he starts out quite conversational, listening, inviting, not attacking. There are lots of ways throughout this conversation where Jad could just stop and say, "You're a racist. What you're saying is racist." He could absolutely say that to him, but he slowly builds up and phrases things. Okay, one of the best rephrasings that he does here is after the barbecue joint owner gives a response that sounds racist. Jad says, "Okay, look, I just want to clarify for our listeners, it's going to sound like you're using some legal mumbo jumbo to mask what is ultimately a support of segregation." And that's just, he says, "I just want to let you know that's what it's going to sound like to many of our listeners." Okay? That's an incredible rephrasing, because you think back to the rhetorical situation. What is he doing in that moment? He's taking his interviewee and trying to place the interviewee in the position of the audience or the podcast listener. And so rather than calling him out himself as the narrator and the interviewer of the podcast, rather than Jad doing it, he's saying, look, this is bigger than just me. I want you to think about everyone else who's listening to this. And I just want to say, this is what it sounds like. And then he gives him a chance to say, to confirm or to disavow that. Is that what you mean? And he doubles down, right? And so, but what I want you to do is I want you to think of two things when you listen to this moment, okay, in the interview. I want you to think of, one, how conversational versus how interrogational is each one of these questions that Jad asks, and two, why? What is the purpose of Jad approaching the interview in this way? Okay, we've just said, I just told you a minute ago, we're doing mostly conversational style interviews in this course, not interrogation. But Jad confronts, rightly so, someone with some racist ideas, and that takes a little bit more of a move to an interrogation. But the way that he goes about that, the way that the questions evolve, matters. And so my question to you is why? What is the effect on the audience, on us listeners? He has multiple audiences. He has primary audiences and secondary audiences. Think about that. Think about the cultural context when this comes out. This is during the Trump era in the United States, highly divided politics in the United States. Okay? What is the effect of Jad asking those interview questions in that particular way? Conversational, then more interrogation, bits and pieces, but definitely confronting someone over their beliefs and opinions rather than just accepting it and writing it down. What is at stake? Why is that important? How is it likely to affect the listeners, primary listeners, secondary audiences? And why does that matter in the larger cultural context? Okay, think about that. And to conclude, what I want to say is this is exactly the kind of thinking you'll want to do on your final, or on your essay, your A1 analytical essay, okay? You'll want to find a specific technique. In this case, we've been talking about interviewing this week. You'll want to locate specific moments in the podcast episode and describe those moments first, and then analyze how those moments, that technique in that moment is likely to impact the different audiences, okay? And then at the end say, so what? Why does that matter? Why does that particular production technique that likely impacts the audiences in these different ways, why does that matter in the cultural context in which this podcast is coming out, okay? That is how you do analysis. And you can pick any different production technique you want. You can look at the narration, you can look at the characters, you can look at the scene creation, you can look at the sound design, you can look at the vocal delivery, you can look at the script writing. Any of those things are techniques. You find the most important moments for that technique in your podcast episode. And then you do those three things. You describe it, you analyze how that technique is likely to affect the different audiences, and then you tell us, so what? Why does that matter in the larger cultural context of this podcast? Okay? Really great to talk about this with you, and happy listening.